and the co-editor most recently of an exploration of arms control negotiations, Hawks, Owls, and Doves, an agenda for avoiding nuclear war. I give you Graham Allison.
Let me welcome you to the forum tonight, and especially welcome our two principal speakers. This is not a debate. This is a conversation, though they represent at least two different points of view, and sometimes more. They're very well known in this community. Indeed, with the media's summit mania these days, it's hard to turn on your television or pick up a newspaper without seeing the name of one or the other or both. Next week, both of them will be in Geneva with some 4,000 other journalists and pundits, microanalyzing what might have been said or should have been said or could have been said, one of them for the Today Show and the other for Good Morning America. So I think we couldn't have a better opportunity here in Cambridge to get a preview of some of what we'll have a chance to hear more about in the weeks to follow with Mr. Gorbachev meeting Mr. Reagan. Our first speaker tonight comes to us fresh from Washington last week, where President Reagan entertained for lunch a number of Sovietologists, and before he packs his bag for Geneva next week, Professor Richard Pipes, a former director of the Russian Research Center and the Frank Baird Professor of History here at Harvard since 1957. Dick emerged in U.S. national security policymaking and debate in 1976 as a member of the CIA's famous Team B, a study that resulted in the doubling of the CIA's estimate of Soviet defense spending to approximately 12% of GNP. President Reagan recruited Dick Pipes to become his full-time top Sovietologist, directing the Eastern European and Soviet Affairs Bureau of the National Security Council, which he did from 1981 until the end of 1982. Most of you have encountered one or more of Dick's numerous publications, including his most recent book, which is entitled Survival is Not Enough. Now, opinions of Dick Pipes' works differ, but they're rarely neutral. President Reagan, on the one hand, regards him as his favorite Sovietologist, and I think that's clear. On the other hand, I always like to quote Solzhenitsyn. Dick doesn't like this, but Solzhenitsyn has remarked that hearing Pipes expound on the nature of the Russians, quote, affects me much the same way as I imagine Rostropovich would feel if he had to listen to a wolf playing the cello. Okay? So, for our first speaker tonight, we're very pleased to have the person whom we've had here in the forum a number of times before and whom I continue to regard as one of our most provocative speakers, Dick Pipes. Thank you.
Allow me to make just two minor corrections. One is that the Team B, which I did indeed chair in '76, had nothing to do with estimates of Soviet military expenditures, though it's very often described as such. It had to do entirely with Soviet strategic intentions. The doubling of the estimates of Soviet expenditures and military was done about 6 months before by the CIA, quite independently. And secondly, what Mr. Solzhenitsyn was saying did not concern my views of the Soviet Union, which he and I fully share, but rather my views of Russian history, in which he's something of an amateur. Now we will talk about this summit. I have lived in this country 45 years now. I have never seen the kind of frenzy that accompanies this particular event. I've had today alone 3 telephone interviews with newspapers and weekly magazines, and a 4th one from a newspaper which I didn't return. I had 2 radio interviews with local stations and 2 invitations to appear on television. This is just absolutely without precedent. And why? About what? This is the greatest non-event, it seems to me, that has happened in years, and I think you'll agree this is so after it's all over. First of all, something about summits. I had a column about this in the Boston Sunday Globe, so I may be repeating myself somewhat, but not all of you probably read it. What I said was that in general, democratic leaders are at a disadvantage when they meet leaders of authoritarian or totalitarian countries in summits. Because even though they have the great advantage of having a popular mandate, in our case, the president is the leader of a rich, prosperous, self-confident nation and the titular head of a great alliance of all the industrial democracies. Nevertheless, encountering a hand-picked man elected by a body of co-opted leaders, he labors under a tremendous disadvantage. And the disadvantage is that he has public opinion, he has legislatures, and he has allies to contend with, and his opponent does not. When the Soviet Union decides on a line which is going to pursue in Geneva, and it is not clear that they have decided because one gets very contradictory signals, particularly in arms control. But once we decide, all the heavy artillery of propaganda opens on the other side, not only from the Soviet Union, not only from Eastern Europe, and not only from the communist press in the West, but it also reverberates in the media in the West, because the media in the West will report statements from Moscow as facts, usually without questioning them, even when they treat the news from Washington as surmises. So when Mr. Weinberger makes a statement about the Soviet Krasnoyarsk radar, the Times will headline it, Weinberger alleges Soviet violate ABM. But if his Soviet counterpart makes a statement, it says Soviets say US violates ABM. So even on the best of circumstances, they have a press here because what they say is reported in the free press. This is a tremendous disadvantage under which a democratic leader operates. The only good summits were summits held in the days when kings were kings and autocrats, when they didn't have to consider the public. The Congress of Vienna was a smashing success. The people who participated there, with the exception of the British Minister of Foreign Affairs, or Foreign Secretary, simply carved up Europe as they saw fit, and we had peace for a century. But Versailles already was a calamity, because the victorious leaders of France, England, and even the United States had to operate under tremendous domestic pressures, and therefore they did not produce a good treaty. Then you had the infamous summit in Munich in 1938. You had the equally infamous summit in Yalta in 1945. They were simply very bad deals for us. So in principle, I think it is a bad thing for a president of a democracy to meet on equal terms with the leader of a state that is a one-party state. But one could still possibly garner some benefits from this kind of an encounter if the preparatory work is done. That is to say, if the two leaders meet after their respective ministers of foreign affairs, their ambassadors, and the so-called experts have, in long, drawn-out sessions away from the limelight and from the glare of publicity, agreed on these very complex issues, be they arms control or even something much relatively simpler than that, such as cultural agreements or what have you. But in fact, nothing of the kind exists. There are no accords whatsoever as of now, and it's almost inconceivable that any accords of any kind will be signed before next week. Therefore, the two heads of state are essentially meeting each other without having anything accomplished at all. The President Reagan has always said that one of the preconditions of a successful meeting is to have something in hand. And indeed, this was always also the Soviet position. There was the Soviet position as long as they had sick leaders who couldn't stand up without being supported on both sides. The moment they got a man who could stand up, they became very eager for a summit, even though nothing has been agreed upon. Well, but that's one reason why I'm pessimistic about the agreement. It is simply absolutely inconceivable that any major agreements will be hammered out on such complex issues as arms control, though one might conceive possibly some general outlines being agreed upon in Geneva. For example, I think it's extremely unlikely, but it's conceivable that in the case of strategic defense initiative, some agreement could be broadly charted as to what constitutes testing, for example. I doubt it, because I think President Reagan will not submit this to discussion. And thirdly, even if one didn't have an agreement in hand of any kind, say a cultural agreement, an agreement to open consulates, the kind that we've been discussing when I was still in Washington, we already had a consular agreement virtually sealed. That is now over 3 years ago. Even if you don't have that, at least you could have a nice atmosphere where the two leaders will shake hands and smile at each other and come out with a communique that while we haven't agreed on very much, at least we have made a beginning, we have gotten acquainted, and this augurs well for the future. But this also is not likely to happen, because I met our delegation as we returned from Moscow the day after they came back, and they all looked shell-shocked. Last year they had been some dreadful experience, not only because they were tired from flying back and forth, but they received a tremendously hostile welcome in Moscow. Gorbachev was interrupting incessantly and saying things about the United States that our delegation thought was entirely untrue. There was a feeling in our delegation that he either deliberately or maybe unconsciously was repeating false information about our intentions and even misquoting high American officials, all with the intent of showing that we are belligerent and unwilling to come to any agreement with them. So I think he's going to end up with a twofold battle. It will be a battle over the agenda. The Russians wanting to narrow the agenda to arms control, where they enjoy tremendous advantages because they get the support of the Europeans, and because they can then conceal their misdeeds in the third world, such as Afghanistan. There will be one battle, and our side wanting to broaden the agenda to include both regional issues and human rights violations. And the second battle will be a battle of charms, and there I think we will win, hands down. I don't find Gorbachev in the least charming. I think he speaks execrable Russian, judging by what I heard on French TV. I don't think that the thing that impressed Time magazine, him, he wore white, clean shirts, is going to be a tremendous asset. Our president wears clean shirts. I think if it's battle of charm, I think our president will get the upper hand. He is simply an absolute master at this sort of thing. And if it reduces itself purely to public relations, it will be, I think, a victory for us by knockout. But is it worth all of this attention? In the meantime, the Soviets have released a new party program, which the press ignores. All kinds of economic experiments are going on. Major offensive in Afghanistan. Jaruzelski has stepped down as head of the administration and taken over the party. And all this gets completely shoved under the rug while everybody focuses on this event which Secretary Schultz called a spectator event, a spectacle which really has no political significance at all. Therefore, the administration is trying to attenuate expectations, but the media are whooping it up, and there will be tremendous letdown when it's all over, I think.
Our second speaker is Marshall Goldman, professor of economics at Wellesley and associate director of Harvard's Russian Research Center. A equally peripatetic scholar and commentator to our first speaker. On the morning of Brezhnev's death, his wife tells me he was awakened at 5 a.m. by CBS for a comment, wrote an article for the New York Times and another one for the Boston Globe that day, appeared on the CBS Evening News, and didn't miss his 2 classes at Wellesley. So I think that's some achievement. A Harvard PhD, Marshall is the author of a half-dozen books, especially on the Soviet economy. His most recent article being Gorbachev and Economic Reform, which is in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. About his most recent book, which is entitled The USSR in Crisis, The Failure of an Economic System, the Wall Street Journal, not usually one of Marshall's bigger fans, concluded, quote, by a somewhat circuitous road, surprisingly, Mr. Goldman reaches the correct conclusion, close quote. So our second speaker, Marshall Goldman. Thanks for having me.
Well, it may not be surprising, but I don't fully share Dick's views, and I will describe my differences to some extent. First of all, I think this is great fun. On the contrary, I think the whole exercise is very good. I think it's educational. It's certainly better than talking about who won the World Series and who has what kind of scoring average. Of course, the stakes are much higher. But I think to the extent that the American public can focus its attention on such things, I think that's to our advantage as a country and as individuals. One of the things we complain about all the time is that we don't focus on international relations enough. And here, indeed, this is an important venture. I have some suggestions, which I will try to provide at the end, about what we might do to reduce some of the hype, but I do think it's very important. What I'm going to try to do in the brief time I have is to talk about why the Soviets want the summit, in my view, why we want the summit, in my view, which may not agree completely with Dick's point of view, the chances for success, and is there any value in the whole exercise, which you've already heard me suggest I think there is. Well, why do the Soviets want the summit? And I would suggest that they have their own priorities and they have their own pressures, and I would disagree, I think, probably more than anything else with the fact that Gorbachev doesn't have to worry about a constituency. I think he has an enormous constituency that he has to worry about. It's not that he has to go for elections. It's not that he has to worry about public opinion polls. There I agree 100% with Dick. But in my mind, what Gorbachev is doing right now is really going through Act One of a two-act drama. The first act, of course, is Geneva, and that's really the minor act. The climactic act is really the second one, which is going to take place in February, when they have their 5-year or every 5th-year party Congress, where they will indeed talk about the economic issues that bedevil the country. Gorbachev, I think, wants to come to Geneva despite a series of rebuffs that he's been receiving at the hands of Reagan, who I think has been masterful in the way he's handled it. Many people are skeptical of Star Wars, but in my mind, it's Star Wars that made the Russians come to Geneva in January for the meeting between Schultz and Gromyko, and it's Star Wars that makes them come back to this coming meeting next week between the General Secretary and the President. He needs that momentum. Gorbachev needs that momentum to show that, in a sense, he can take Reagan's measure. Because as strong as Gorbachev is, and in my mind, again, and I suspect Dick may disagree a little bit here, Gorbachev, I think, is probably the strongest political manipulator the Soviet Union has had, period. That includes Stalin and Lenin. It doesn't mean that Gorbachev can shoot people, but it does mean in 3 months' period of time, he removed his rival. Stalin took longer than that. In 6 months' time, he would remove the prime minister, who should have been removed by all means. And he didn't have to share power with anyone, unlike Khrushchev, who had to share it with Bulganin, and unlike Brezhnev, who had to share it with Kosygin. Gorbachev is his own man, but as important as he is, the economy is still bigger. And of course, as an economist, I always like to think of those things. What he needs is to develop this momentum to show that he can meet Reagan, to show that he can meet Mitterrand, to show that indeed he can do a variety of things within the country to get the country moving again, because it certainly needs moving. What has he been doing? Look at what Gorbachev has been doing. We look at his international exposure, but if you watch him inside the country, it's absolutely amazing performance. Anybody who can stop Russians from drinking has to know something that a lot of us don't know. That doesn't mean that it's prohibition. It doesn't mean that there still are not drunks. It doesn't mean that there still is not alcohol poisoning, and it still doesn't mean that they are devoid of poor work habits. But fewer people are coming to work drunk. That's unusual. The recent surveys showed that until this whole thing began, 40% of the people had to have the workers would have a few shots before they began their day's activities. He's had a crackdown on discipline, which was begun in part by his mentor, Andropov, but he's carrying it through. He's running all over the country in a way as if he is running for election. Nobody except for Khrushchev has traveled as rapidly throughout the country in the Soviet Union as Gorbachev does. And given the time span that he's been doing it in, it's even more impressive than Khrushchev. He started in Moscow, going out from the cocoon of the Kremlin. He went then to Leningrad, met with workers in their apartments, which of course is not the normal Soviet approach. Brezhnev and certainly Andropov and Chernyenko rarely ventured outside the confines of the Kremlin. He then went to Kiev, he went to Dnepropetrovsk, he went to Minsk, and then he went out to Siberia, to the oil fields, and to the farmlands in Kazakhstan. And in each case, he was saying, we've got to get the country moving again. You're screwing up here. You're drunk, you're indisciplined, you're corrupt, and you've got to shape up. And I think that's very important because, indeed, he's so distracted by this. I think that was the main reason he decided not to come to the United States for the summit, that he would have to have it in a place where it could be a much shorter thing to do. And I think that also explains the fact, and I don't mean to make this as an excuse, but I think that also explains the fact why he had not read or was unfamiliar with the American position just recently presented in Geneva by Reagan last week. He acknowledged to Schultz that he wasn't all that familiar with what was being done, and I think in large part because he's got his hands full. He's firing ministers right and left. He's firing party people right and left because he's so concerned about what has to be done inside the country. But my feeling is that discipline and changing personnel is not enough. He needs a radical reform, and short of that, which I don't think he's going to get a radical reform, he's got to do something about the arms race, and that's his pressure, and he's got his own military-industrial complex that drives him crazy that he's got to worry about. How does this affect Geneva? Well, the Russians fear SDI and the new technology. They have more faith in our technology than we do. They're worried about the military implications in the sense that it will lead to new technology. And they're already having enough difficulty matching our present technology. They fear that it will lead to new forms. Already it has, for that matter. It's been announced that we have developed a brand new supercomputer in terms of speed, new lasers, new reactors, and the Russians see this and see this going ahead and not being able to catch up with it. And if nothing else, as one of my Russian friends told me during the Geneva meetings in January, if nothing else, they have to do something to hold down the military in particular, but the military-industrial complex, to prevent them from ratcheting up another level of escalation. And if they can only get a standoff, that's what's important. And that, in a sense, in my mind, is what is driving Gorbachev. So it's not just the United States which is under pressure. It is not just Reagan who has to worry about Congress, and we should all be like Reagan and have to worry as little about Congress as he does, a man with his kind of mandate. He's got to respond to the economy, and he's got to respond at Geneva. Now, why do we want the summit? Well, in my mind, the best way to deal with the Soviet Union is not to ignore them, but to recognize that they're there and always be on the verge of doing something. I call this on the verge theory. When are the Russians responsive? They're responsive when we're about to go to the Olympics. They're responsive when we're talking about a grain deal. They're responsive when we're talking about a summit. They're responsive now in letting Mrs. Bonner talk on the telephone and come to this country. I think they would have preferred that she had come to this country before the summit, but she just won't do it until her husband is better. Letting Sakharov talk on the phone in ways that they've not allowed for 6 years. Letting Reagan appear unjammed on the radio, that I should consider that a concession, I suspect some people would think is crazy, but that by Soviet standards is a concession. That they should let him appear in his vestia, although abridged. That they should release some refuseniks who've been in prison and been unallowed to go for 15 years. And a willingness to talk, to acknowledge that there may be something wrong at Krasnoyarsk, to acknowledge that indeed they should stop testing. Now, part of my strategy would always be to keep them on the verge. One of my friends calls this theory linkage interruptus. Never quite culminate what you're trying to do, but always keep them busy, keep them occupied, because indeed that's, it seems to me, how you're going to get them to respond. When you push them off in a corner, they don't seem to be responsive. What about the chances of success? Well, I'm an optimist. I hope I'm not naive, but I'm more optimistic than Dick is. If nothing else, I think the agreement that there should be a series of annual summits is an important one, and I think that there probably will be. I would suspect that Gorbachev will probably be coming here or wanting to come here shortly after his February Congress to meet in the United States. And I think there will probably be a return visit by Reagan. Again, by my standards, if to the extent that these things take place on a more frequent basis, then indeed they become less emotional and less passionate in this way. And I think that's good, and it gives us a chance to have on that verge concept in operation. I think there may be some mini-agreements. I'm a little more pessimistic than I was a few weeks ago when I thought we were much closer to them, but my sense is that there may still be a consular agreement. There may be an environmental agreement. Again, thinking back to 1972 when there was a meeting between Nixon and Brezhnev, it seemed like there was nothing. Of course, everything was in Kissinger's back pocket, and there is no Kissinger, or at least Schultz doesn't have a big back pocket in this particular instance. But indeed, there are a series of trade negotiations that have been going on. There have been even a series of discussion about some of the refuseniks and some other issues which have to do that are tangent to some extent to the arms control thing. But I think there probably will be an agreement about arms control to push harder And that in itself, I think, is an accomplishment, because I don't think Reagan is going to bend over and collapse and make silly agreements. Indeed, when Reagan can reach the point, and the administration can reach the point where they can say there are 4 or 5 nuggets, 4 or 5 seeds that warrant nurturing, that the Russians indeed seem to have come along, that we indeed have seemed to come along. It may be that we've not, signed and sealed everything in the beginning, but I am really quite pleased that there's some substance, and the Russians were willing to stay on another week. And the very fact that we simply keep talking, I think, is important. Well, is it worth it? Well, it's going to be a circus. There's not going to be 4,000 people there. There are going to be 5,000 journalists there. So, we're grateful that we have hotel rooms the way things are going. But I think it's important to recognize that Gorbachev has his pressures. He will not come there oblivious to what's going on in the Soviet Union. And Reagan has his pressures, and I think that's good. Reagan's pressures, I think, if anything, don't come from the Congress or his advisors. I think they come from Nancy. I think that she's got the sense of history, which I think is important. And by the way, I think Gorbachev has his rights. If I were watching what's going to happen in Geneva, I think you want to keep your eye on what the 2 wives are doing. I think that you're going to see more. First of all, they're going to be visible. They're not going to be locked up all day. And I'm serious when I say this. She reads his stuff. Now, who am I referring to? Well, both Nancy and to Reitze. One of my American business friends told me that he went in preparing a proposition for Gorbachev. He was told to make an English version available so that Reitze could read it, because she likes to read these things in English. And I think pressure can help. The pressure cooker atmosphere can be a useful thing. McFarlane, when he concluded the meetings in Geneva in January, told David Hartman that everybody was asking. It's not funny, because this is exactly the point that I want to make. Hartman felt a little guilty about all these things in the sideshow and the interviewing of journalists by one another. And so in a defensive way, he said, well, what do you think about all this hoopla that's going on? And McFarlane said, if it hadn't been for the hoopla, we wouldn't have felt under the pressure. We wouldn't have stayed longer. We wouldn't have ironed out some of the things that we would otherwise have simply let go. And in my sense, I think the same kind of thing could happen in this case, and I'm not prepared to write it off as a wasted expenditure of time.
Charlie Truehard asked me to try to stir up the conversation a little bit. Let me start with a quote from Dick Pipes' piece in the Globe on Sunday, which relates to Marshall's proposal for Gorbachev coming here after February and Reagan going to Moscow. It says, the final paragraph says, quote, "For this reason, one must hope that Schulz's proposal of annual summits will be quickly abandoned. Such spectator sports not only paralyze our executive for months, but they also create an unhealthy climate of excitement, which precludes serious attention being given to complicated issues of national and international security." Richard? Reasons.
Well, I think they're stated there. My friends in the administration for the past several months have been running around like headless chickens, trying to cough up proposals, trying to anticipate what the Russians will produce and how to deal with it, and they have not been able to deal with serious issues, and that just simply cannot be. Our personnel is not that large. In the National Security Council, there were 3 of us, actually there are 2.5 of us, who took care of Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. 2.5, I say, because one of these persons took care of other things as well. Well, this is nothing. And if you have to occupy yourself, as my successor does, Jack Matlock, with these issues, and he has a bigger job than I did because he's also in charge of Western Europe, he has to neglect everything else. And one of the results of it is, incidentally, that the State Department comes out on top because they've got massive troops, whereas the White House doesn't. And that's a matter of some importance, which I take it the audience doesn't appreciate. But in this competition for who molds policy, the number of people you can field to draft papers is very important. Not to mention the Russians, who probably have many times over the same number of people. So just purely from a bureaucratic point of view, this is disaster, I think, because you really can't do anything else. But in addition...
on the bureaucratic point, though, what about, there's at least one other agency in Washington with divisions.
Besides White House
NSC and
State Department?
State. Yes.
What do you mean, what, defense? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, defense too. I mean, I don't have such good connections with defense, but I imagine they must have been extremely busy, or at least Richard Pearl and people who deal with international affairs, exceedingly busy. I mean, Pearl must have spent a lot of time reading the ABM Treaty to come up with this interpretation. But it just...
Not very long reading it, but a lot of time thinking.
Think about it. It's not, it disorients our government. We have too small numbers of qualified people to deal with these issues to be concentrated on this spectacle.
Marshall, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think, I agree with Dick that indeed there's a lot of wasted effort and energy, but I think this is the main thing that confronts the world and the two nations, and I'd rather see them doing things like this. I don't feel that bad if the State Department is involved with larger divisions. I think that's my understanding, what the State Department is supposed to be doing in part. I mean, I recognize that the whole concept of the National Security Council is to be lean and quick and adept, but I'm not worried about that. I do worry that with some presidents there could be undue pressure, and they might succumb readily. I don't feel that in this case, and I really think it's important, that we do have regular meetings. I'm also cognizant of the fact that some people will say the minute the two presidents sit down at a table, they will resolve all the world's problems, and there will be a sense of disappointment when they don't. But to the extent that we can have regular meetings, then it becomes a much more normal kind of thing. And I think part of the problem with President Reagan and part of the problem with Gorbachev is that they've not had a chance to meet each other. I don't want to be unduly naive about this and say that they'll slap each other on the back, and as one of my business friends once told me, all I have to do is get a Soviet businessman to go to Las Vegas, and we have no problem understanding one another after that. I don't accept that kind of thing, but I really do feel that these meetings are important, and if they can't spend their time focusing on these upcoming meetings and trying to think of new ideas, then I think somebody should be doing it, and that's what I would sense our government is for.
Well, I would agree that sympathy and understanding between heads of state is a good thing, but it is far from enough. And if you have to pay a very heavy price for it, it may not be worth it, because the real work is done by bureaucrats of the second and third echelon. Now, we try time and again, when I was there and I know since, to get together with the Russians on specifics, try to agree. As I say, such small issues as agreements on cultural agreements. We don't have a cultural agreement with the Russians since '79. And in '82, we began once again to activate it. It was scrapped after the invasion of Afghanistan. So we once again began to negotiate with them. And it is been torpedoed by the Soviet insistence that we commit ourselves to returning any Soviet student who doesn't want to go back, who wants to seek asylum here. We will not sign this kind of an agreement. Therefore, the thing has stopped. On the airline agreement, again, a relatively trivial agreement, it is again hung up on the question of Soviet unwillingness to sit down and negotiate some kind of an air agreement in the
Commercial agreement.
No, in the Pacific. No. To prevent, no, it deals really with East Asia. To agree on corridors and on measures to be taken so would have no more of the Korean airline tragedies. That has been stopped there. And so on and so forth. Now, if you can't agree on these things, where you have time, where experts sit down, and where you don't have the limelight, where people don't have to make speeches and so on, but sit down across the table, do it just where we are sitting for weeks and months, then what chance is there of the heads of state, where every word of who is scrutinized and who have the Klieg lights on them and so on, arriving at anything sensible?
Well, I think the way to get that is, given the fact that the junior level administrators and bureaucrats aren't willing to do that, they maybe need a little shove. And I'm not, again, if it were a different president, I might worry that he might concede something, but I don't think we're the ones that are going to have to give up anything on this. I think it's the Russians who are under the pressure. And if you stand back and from neither country and watch who's been making what concessions before this particular thing, I think the Russians have been more forthcoming than we have.
Such as? I mean, Mrs. Bonner? Or things
well,
of
they're small things, but I think that the very fact that they came back after they said they wouldn't come back unless we changed our mind. Reagan didn't change his mind. He went full speed ahead with the Pershing and the SDI, and they came back. No, it's no great humiliation, but I mean, it certainly does indicate that they're hungry for some kind of accommodation in my mind.
Oh, that is true.
Let me get you both to comment on one other question. If you ask not just what you think is the most likely outcome, but what do you think is the best outcome that's at least 5% likely, and the worst outcome that's at least 5% likely, so we can see the brackets, and so that if the week after it's not in your 5 percentiles, we'll worry. So, Richard?
Well, the best scenario that I envisage is the president coming out and saying, Mr. Gorbachev and I had frank discussions. We understand each other better now in our disagreements, but also our agreements. And while we haven't been able to arrive at any concrete conclusions of any kind, we've agreed to continue this dialogue both on the ministerial level and expert level. And we think this is a good thing which will eventually attenuate the differences between us. That is the best outcome that I can see, possibly with some very broad and rather meaningless SOP on arms control thrown in, just to make it seem a little bit better for the allies. But that's about the best. At its worst, they could be standing growling at each other, and you can have the kind of mess that you had in Vienna between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which then led to the Berlin Wall and to the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba.
I agree with Dick about the worst. I mean, each one walking out shaking their fist at one another, and indeed, or miscalculating what the other is capable of. I think in terms of the best, I go just a bit further than Dick, and say that everything he said, and then say that in addition, we have instructed our assistants to focus on arms control agreement by categories. We are far apart. We're not as far apart as we were 2 months ago in terms of land-based, intermediate missiles, and we want to break these down into subcategories, and we think we can work something out because indeed, as the President said, there are seeds there that warrant nurturing, and we want to push that, we want to fertilize that even more.
Let me ask one more to try to get the differences sharpened here, and then we're going to open it for general questions from the audience. If you try to stand back from, I think, Dick, your metaphor is that mostly summit watching is like weather forecasting. So the question is it going to rain or is it going to snow next Thursday, and we become very interested in it as we come to the events. If we stand back from the weather forecasting to ask about what's happening at the deeper structure in the U.S.-Soviet relationship, and over the range of issues which might be discussed at Geneva, including not only arms control, but regional issues and human rights. Now, theory one would have it that we're entering a period in which objective conditions have created a real window of opportunity. And you could go down the list of reasons why, both from the Soviet point of view, there may be ranges or areas in which explicit agreements could be of advantage to the Soviet Union that might serve U.S. advantages, and you could go down the U.S. side. You've got a new Soviet leader. He's in the business of consolidating his power. He's got an economy at home that doesn't work. You're in a period after a significant American military buildup that creates some real incentives for the Soviets to look for agreements, a range of possibilities there. So what theory one has, we're in a period in which the underlying substructure is promising, and the question is whether the governments can get their acts together to that end. Theory two says, no, we're not into the fundamentals are contrary to a period for doing business either at summits or privately, and the two parties are just going to go their way because their differences are so great. As between theory one and theory two or some alternative, what would you say?
Yeah, I'd rather take the alternative because I just don't want to really concentrate so much on the summit. I don't think anything can happen at the summit.
No, not for the summit, but this is over the next year or two,
next
as
few
to
years.
the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Yes.
My view is, and I elaborate upon it in my book, Survival is Not Enough, is that the Soviet Union is in a very deep crisis, economic, political, and psychological. And it needs a respite. It needs reform. It needs to do what China has been doing for the past 10 years. Turn its energies inwards, away from militarism, expansion, ideology towards economic modernization, and in general, bringing the Soviet Union into the modern world, where they really aren't right now. They're really the only major country left in the world that still believes in the virtues of central planning. Almost everybody else getting away from it. This is what they need. But logically, that's what they would do. But there are many difficulties. One is, of course, as everybody knows, the enormous opposition of the bureaucratic apparatus, because under any reform, the bureaucratic apparatus will lose power, and they're afraid of that. And they rationalize their fear in various ways. That is one problem. The other problem is the need of Gorbachev to assert himself as a powerful, strong leader, and he can only do that by being nasty and rough on the United States. And there's a third problem, which is specifically the Reagan problem. And I personally don't believe there will be any agreements with the Reagan administration, either now or in the next 3 years. And that is because Reagan is the first American president ever, and I go back to Wilson, who was president when the Russian Revolution took place, to have questioned the, not just the viability, but legitimacy of Soviet ideology, of the Soviet system. His speech, which he delivered to Westminster in June 1982, shook them to the very marrow of their bones. I remember we were getting dispatches from Russia. There's never been anything quite like it. They couldn't believe their ears. They took it to be a declaration of war, in effect. And I think that they simply don't trust him. They think that he's essentially engaged in a maneuver, trying to pretend to be nice in order to take advantage of them. I simply do not think that this is feasible. I mean, I don't criticize the president for it. I think he did well, and I did what I could to contribute to it. I'm glad the Russians were shaken up. I think it's good for all of us. It's good for them too, for that matter. But it's a fact, it's a political fact, that they'll find it exceedingly difficult to really come to terms with Reagan. For all the other reasons which I mentioned, the internal reasons and so on, while the objective factors push them towards reform, and all reform requires accommodation with the West, because you cannot carry out reform inside Russia without accommodation with the West, because you have to be able to scale down on defense expenditures, and you also require credits and technology from the West. Despite all of this, I don't think this is in the cards yet.
I agree basically with what Dick said. I should point out he alluded very subtly to it, but the Westminster speech, of course, by President Reagan was largely, well, in good part, some of the most important ideas were written by Dick. So to some extent, Reagan was expressing, and it was a good speech. That's not the problem. I agree that the distrust is enormous, but again, I have watched this president not as closely in any sense as Dick or some others in this room have, but I notice the man is capable of reversals. Now, I said earlier that I don't think that he's going to give away the store in dealing with the Soviet Union, but I do think there is a sense of history. The man, after all, is finishing out his last term of office. He has had some serious physical problems, and I think that you come to begin thinking about mortality. And I think, if you believe what Reagan says, and I do, he said when he came into office, he was going to build up the United States militarily and economically, and he's done that. He has provided enormous sums for the military budget, and indeed now the economy, while the deficit is a headache, economically we're certainly much stronger than we were when he came into office. So I think that indeed, following his scenario, once he's strong, then he's prepared to talk. Now, I think that he's aware of the fact, partly because of some of the things that Dick and others have prepared for him, that the Soviet Union has enormous problems. And the Soviet Union, unlike some other previous summits, particularly those dealing with Khrushchev, is not coming here to the summit as the one who's in charge, as the one who's self-confident. Dick indeed said this himself. So I think that Gorbachev, while he's a very strong man and I think probably very self-confident, certainly he should be self-confident in what he's done at home, is going to be coming not as a supplicant, but certainly not as the one who's going to dictate policy. And I think that there is this chance that Gorbachev, even though he made these very nasty statements to Schultz last week, I think welcomes and needs and wants, if nothing else, a standoff, if not a complete meeting of minds. I think that Gorbachev, of all the leaders we've seen, even including Khrushchev, I think he's more inward-looking. Maybe Andropov was another instance of that. Inward looking, and I think in a sense, for the Soviet Union, Gorbachev is a good man. If I were a Soviet citizen, I would be pleased with the fact that here's a man who does indeed care. I don't think he knows what he has to do, but he knows where he's at, and he knows that's not the place where the economy or the political society should be. And I don't think he's going to solve the problem, but at least he cares, and I think he sincerely cares. And I think that's important for us, and I think in an international environment, that's good. And I think this, I may be over-optimistic, but I think the two of them coming together at this time, it could bring something, and it may be too hopeful, and that's exactly what Dick warns against, but I welcome this.
I'll be watching the Nielsen ratings for ABC, NBC.
I think on that we should open it up for questions from the audience. There are microphones on either side of the ground floor and either side of the second floor. And if you're in the third floor and you wave your hand, you're going to have to speak loudly, but I might recognize you as well. But on the first floor over here.
Thank you. I was wondering if both of you could explore the implications of a worst-case outcome. If indeed we have this get-together in Geneva and it turns out to be some form of catastrophe, or at least turns out to be a repulsion of the minds instead of a meeting of the minds, all done in living color in front of 100+ million viewers, what is that going to do for the international scene and for the degree of tension? In fact, could this turn out to be very counterproductive for the world situation if it turns out to be a worst-case scenario? Would it be far better that, I mean, is there a question of responsibility, in fact, at issue here in meeting without proper preparation? Are they risking a great worsening in tension? And also, can they, if indeed there are serious implications of failure, can both of these gentlemen afford failure?
Well, I think to begin with, it was a mistake to agree on a summit before there were any other accords. I think we should have stuck to our guns and said we'll go to a summit only if and when there are some accords on other issues. And to go to the summit without having anything in hand at all is very risky and unnecessarily so. Will it have a very adverse effect on international relations if things don't go well? I frankly don't think so. For one thing, the Russians are extremely thick-skinned. Just consider what the Chinese have been saying about them. And they've called them Nazis, fascists, and so on. And every day the Russians say that they should come to terms with the Chinese and so on and so forth. It hasn't offended them at all. Nor were they offended when Hitler called them all kinds of names and in August 1939 they made a very nice treaty with them. That doesn't matter. To my mind, what really matters in the long term is what happens inside the Soviet Union. That's where the crux lies, not Soviet-American relations, but developments inside the Soviet Union, towards which American-Soviet relations can contribute one way or the other, but essentially marginal. The real processes are internal. I believe, and I will concede that I am in a minority on this issue, but I firmly believe that the worse the internal situation gets inside the Soviet Union, the better the prospects for peace. Because all of historical experience indicates that they reform themselves only when the internal pressures are such that they can no longer postpone facing them. This was true of the Imperial Russia, this was true of Soviet Russia. Therefore, what we can contribute to this process is not making life easier for them by making it easier for them to expand, because they can then tell the people, all right, you don't have much to eat, you don't have good housing, you don't have this and that, but look, we're painting the map red, and this wins a lot of people over. And by not giving them credits in technology and so on and so forth, because then they have to conduct an internal reform. So I really do believe that that's where the crux of the future lies, is in the ability and willingness of the Soviet leadership finally to face up to their internal problems. Once we do that, then everything else will follow.
Well, let me, Marshall, in answering the question, let me get you to address Dick's final point as well, which is the extent to which you agree or disagree with the remedy, which is make them better in order to make them worse in order to make them better.
Well, you know, you and I were talking about this a little bit beforehand. I'm not sure how that affects the United States, but if you really want reform inside the Soviet Union, I think indeed you do have to have very catastrophic conditions exist. But I don't think we're the ones to do that. I think they have to bring it on themselves, as the Chinese did. If you look at the two countries that in the communist world who are undergoing the most significant reform, it's China and Hungary. How did the Chinese do it? Well, they did it because they had a cultural revolution and basically destroyed their political hierarchy and their economy at the same time. That served to be very good because things were so bad you had to go someplace else, and that opened up the door for reform. The same thing in Hungary in terms of the revolution that took place in '56. Perhaps Brezhnev's greatest sin was that he didn't live another 4 years and bring the country down to its knees. He only had it down to its thighs, and he had gone down a little bit further. Because then things would have been bad. But they have to do that themselves. I think when the Russians sense that their pressure is coming from the outside, they tighten their belts, and despite their girth, they have the narrowest waistlines in the world when it comes to that, because there always is another notch in the belt, it seems, where they can rally around the flag and ward off that outside interference. So I do agree that, indeed, that's the best time for reform, but I don't think we're anywhere near that now. And indeed, to the extent that they're doing better than they were under Brezhnev, Baibakov, before he was fired, said, in fact, well, what do we need reform for? Who says central planning is bad? We're growing at 2 to 3% a year, so why rock the boat? In other words, you have to have things very bad before you can really make the fundamental kind of changes that are necessary. But I don't think we're the ones to do that, and I don't think we're the ones to hold off either selling them grain or selling them technology. That's not the way it happens. In fact, when we sell them technology, some of the research I'm doing presently indicates that they use the technology so badly that it actually tends to screw them up. And I'm not saying this entirely facetiously, but they do very well with military technology what they steal. They do badly with the technology they buy. So therefore, my conclusion is coming back to the question, I do, even though I say I'm optimistic, I think if things go wrong, they could go wrong badly, and I do worry about that. I don't think it's going to happen, simply because I think we have waited too long to have such a meeting, although it was not our doing, it was the Soviets doing. I mean, I think, I was at, this is name dropping, I concede, but it's the only name I have to drop, so you'll have to forgive me. I was in the Kremlin in 1978 at the dinner. I don't know, some of you, I see somebody who may have been in the room at the same time, but there's a Kremlin dinner for an American group of businessmen, and Brezhnev was there. And two people I noticed on either side of Brezhnev, in the back, kind of valets, their function was to help the man stand up and help the man sit down, and when he walked out of the room, make sure that he walked out of the room instead of had to be carried out of the room. It turned out subsequently when Andropov became ill, the same two guys were there. Then when Chernenko, the same two guys were, I don't know what they're doing now. This is the first planned unemployment they have. And so that's the reason why, as Dick says, the summits didn't take place up until now. But indeed, I think it's important that we're over that we reach the point where we can talk to one another and not have it become a major miracle. So I don't think it's going to happen, but if it does happen, it will be very unfortunate, the scenario you pose.
Okay. Question up in the balcony.
Professor Pipes, I wonder if you could take a moment to expand on some of the causes of the rigidity in the Soviet economic system that renders that country so unable to undertake substantial economic reform of the Chinese variety that we're seeing now. And if you could also perhaps give us a feeling for your assessment of the probability that such substantial reforms could ever be undertaken.
Well, it's really more a question for Professor Goldman, but I'll answer it first, perhaps. The rigidity is due to the insistence of the party on managing the economy. And that is done in part because of an old-fashioned idea they have that centralization, the application of rational methods of allocation of resources and so on, is a better way of getting high results than the seeming chaos of market economies or even semi-market economies. The real reason is the vested interest of the party bureaucracy in doing that. The rationalization is that this is more efficient. And when you show them it is not more efficient, then they will argue, well, that's because people drink, or because people show up for work, or because we don't have enough the latest computers. When I hear they talk about discipline and computers, you know they don't want to reform. because this is a way around reform. The second factor is a question of incentives. They have experimented with incentives. You know, essentially, Soviet workers in factories and on farms get paid by the time they put in and not by the product they produce. They have norms which they have to fulfill. It is absolutely in the interest not to exceed the norms, because if they exceed the norms, then they might get small bonuses, but more likely the norms will be raised the following year. Now, they've experimented with various ways. For example, forming so-called links, both in farms and in factories. These are groups of 8, 10 people. This is a very traditional Russian way. It goes back to the pre-revolutionary artel. They band themselves together. They make a contract with the collective farm or the factory and say, we will put in, we undertake to do this, do so much, and you pay us by the piece or by the product in agriculture. And they have a spectacular results. And yet, and Soviet leaders, this Brezhnev and I think Andropov and possibly also Gorbachev, have said that's the system we've got to adopt, and yet it's being sabotaged all the time because the party bureaucracy doesn't want it. And there are endless examples in Soviet newspapers of how a link was formed, how well they have done it, how then were forced to dissolve because of opposition of party officials. So to answer your question very briefly, it is largely because of the tremendous vested interest which the party bureaucracy has in the existing system. It doesn't do well for the country, it does very well for them. And what you would need is an extremely strong leader who can break this resistance and introduce, I won't say a free economy, clearly not, but at least a mixed economy where many of the sectors of the economy, particularly agriculture and the service sector, will be turned over to small private enterprise.
Thank you.
My wife is going to kill me for this, but the question you ask really can't be answered in a very short period of time. I'm writing a book, which is an attempt really to look at exactly the same kind of question. That's why she'll kill me. The point is, besides what Dick said, if you begin to tamper with this structure, which has been ossified for 67 years, you run, well, you're opening up Pandora's box. You run enormous risks. The Soviet Union, you should understand, produces 50% more steel than we or the Japanese do. It's the wrong kind of steel. That implies if you really have a reform, they've got to close those factories down. If you close those factories down, what's going to happen? You're going to have unemployment. You're going to have somebody indicated as somebody who made the wrong kinds of decision about capital allocation. You're going to have then unemployment. At the same time, if you relax controls and try to give additional incentive, you're going to have inflation because prices are going to go up. You can look at to China to see exactly the same kind of thing that's happening. And in addition, if you really want to get to technology, that means you've got to decentralize control. You've got to decentralize the allocation of capital. And that means that you're going to have to, you don't have to have venture capitalists running around the streets of Moscow, but it does mean that you're going to have decision-making someplace other than just in Gosbank in terms of allocating funds. And that takes away the power from the center. It takes power away from the military-industrial complex. And indeed, you may get all kinds of frivolous things and all kinds of graft and corruption, which of the new kind, the kind that we're used to in capitalist societies. The Russians have lived all these years with a social contract which says basically, okay, we'll spare you the chaos, the unemployment, the inflation that typifies capitalist countries. And now suddenly, if they're going to have the sacrifices that they've put up with all these years, and in addition, the unemployment and the inflation and the general chaos that market economies have, then indeed you run the risk of political disruption, if not uprising, and that's just too much to absorb. Think of something that has just been in power for 67 years. It's just doing the wrong kind of thing. The Russian economists acknowledge that, by the way. This is not just a fiction that's being made up here by bourgeois apologists. It's for real. And to unleash all that thing is just too frightening, even for a man like Gorbachev.
Now, this is a very interesting situation. The president, in his speech we've already mentioned, the Westminster speech, referred to Marx indirectly. And he very rightly pointed out that this is a very amusing situation, that actually the Soviet Union conforms today to the Marxist model of the political and social system inhibiting productive forces, which is what's supposed to happen in our society, but hasn't, but it's happening to them. And it's the use of that Marxist language and terminology that so upset them, because they knew it was right. So, yes.
Okay. I have a question for both professors about the Krasnoyarsk radar. First of all, do you feel that this is a violation of the ABM Second, what is the status of its development? And third, how do you think it will be handled at the summit, if at all?
Well, it obviously is a violation because you're not supposed to build such large radars inside the country. Because if you do that, you're supposed to build them only on the periphery of the country. If you build them inside the country, this indicates preparations for an ABM system, which they're not allowed to do. They have one ABM system around Moscow, which they're allowed to have, but they're not allowed to have any others. What goes on inside of it, we don't know, because we have our information primarily from satellites, and they don't penetrate, although our specialists are extraordinarily gifted in interpreting every little bit of evidence that they can find. A pebble on the ground tells them all sorts of things. Even so, you don't quite know what was inside these monstrously large buildings. What will happen well, they have made a completely absurd proposal that they will stop construction of that illegal radar system if we stop modernizing perfectly legal radar systems which we have in Greenland and in Britain. Of course, we're not going to do that. So I don't think we're going to get anywhere. They are proceeding at pace. There are many people who believe in our government that they are, in fact, so far along in developing strategic missile defenses that they may suddenly break out and declare the ABM treaty to be invalid. In fact, suspicions are raised by some people that the real reason they're making all this terrible noise about strategic defense initiatives is not because they're so afraid of it, but because they want to have a pretext for breaking out of the ABM treaty. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but it could serve them as a pretext, saying, well, we tried to prevent the Americans from doing it. They haven't done it, therefore, goodbye to ABM, and we're developing a very major national system of strategic defenses.
The only thing I would add to what Dick said is I think it's significant that they finally, after denying that the Krasnoyarsk thing was a violation at all, have even opened up the possibility of negotiating, although I agree that the terms of negotiation are ridiculous, but at least they put it on the table, which is something they weren't prepared to do until about 2 weeks ago.
I have two questions. One, what are the implications of SDI in terms of technological development in the Soviet Union? And two, how can Gorbachev succeed in terms of turning Russia around technologically where Khrushchev didn't?
Well, the threat of SDI, again, I said, let me repeat what I said earlier, is remarkable. They fear American, if you listen to American scientists, there are large numbers saying it won't come about, it'll be very expensive, but the Russians think that we're going to pull it off, even a fraction of it that will pull it off, which will be disruptive to them. Their problem, their concern is, can they match the new software, the new computer technology that's going to be required to bring the whole thing off? Soviets are having a terribly difficult time mastering computer production. The gap seems to be growing. So that, and around here we've discovered that it may even be shorter than that, because some of the computer firms on 128 found that products they developed already are obsolete after a year and a half. The Soviets' central planning system is just the opposite of that kind of process. It's slow, it's prodding, it takes the capital, it allocates it centrally, it duplicates it, it keeps going on. The Soviets can't handle that kind of thing. They get themselves, I say, caught in this systems gap where if they start out with a certain level of technology, they have to move very rapidly. Why don't the Soviets have better computers? Well, how did our computers develop? You look at our computers and you see one of the ways they developed is that they were used commercially and they were interactive. How were they interactive? They talked on the telephone to one another. That meant that you could have software that could be used for a whole system of computers. Why don't they talk to one another in the Soviet Union? Well, there's no phone system. The Soviet phone system, only 23% of the urban families have phones, and in the rural areas, only 7%. When Sakharov talked on the telephone, he had to go to the post office, which was where the central station, in a sense, was. Why don't they have more telephones? Well, because there are security reasons as well as economic reasons involved. Why don't they have a better phone system? Well, because when you get large phone systems, you need central switching equipment, which involves computers. So why don't they have better phone systems? Because they don't have the computers. Why don't they have better computers? Because they don't have the phone system. And they're kind of caught in this thing, and it is not, and you can find many instances of where this is happening, and the world is simply passing them by. So why couldn't Khrushchev do it? I mean, why wasn't this a problem for Khrushchev? Well, technology was different in his age, and Gorbachev now has a much greater challenge in front of them than Khrushchev had, and he had his problems.
Now that we're breaking up AT&T, we will soon not have a phone system.
Well, there was some thought that we were moving in the same direction.
Dick, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, I'll just say something about the Soviet ABM system. It is just simply not in the league with what we are projecting. It's essentially a point defense system that is destroying warheads as we approach the Earth, whereas ours is a multi-layered system, 3, possibly as many as 7 layers. And it's a totally different technology. And the thing they fear is not only that what this will accomplish in terms of balance of power, because if we succeed in building that system, and if it is as tight as some scientists predicted will be, then the Soviet Union will find itself in a very unpleasant situation of not being able to plan a first strike, which is the very basis of their military strategy, and they'll have to find themselves in a situation in which we have been for many years, of developing a force for a second strike. And that's something they don't like. It's not the way the military think. The other factor which I'd like to mention is that there's a great deal of fallout from this kind of a project, as there was from our landing on the moon. So enormous amounts of benefits in technology financed by the government, which again will give us another leg up on them in the field of technology, industrial as well as military.
Okay, question from over here.
Just ask both professors whether you think there's any possibility somewhere down the road that the deployment and testing of Star Wars might become negotiable on the American side, or whether you think the administration will simply continue to refuse to negotiate on that.
Well, when you're talking about deployment, you're so many years off that you're
Or even testing.
3 or 4 administrations off. Hard to predict at all what will happen. This president, who has 3 more years to run in office, I think is quite determined to proceed with the research and the testing, however it's defined. Deployment will not be a problem in the next 3 years, will not be a problem in the next 7 years. Beyond that, we just can't see.
I think my exactly the same kind of thing. I think he's going to try to encourage. He won't. Here, I don't think he's going to reverse himself. I don't think he's going to reverse the research. The deployment, again, is exactly what Dick said. It's down the road, and what other presidents do remains to be seen.
Let me say one more thing about the president, this particular president. He's a man who holds extremely strong convictions about certain things, and really is not terribly attached to many other things. Taxes are an article of absolute faith with him, and his eyes flare up if anybody suggests raising taxes. And so on. I think Nicaragua and El Salvador have become issues of that importance to him. I think SDI, he sees them. He believes in it very, very firmly. He's not going to yield on it. He may yield on a lot of other things. He's a very amiable man. He's not a fanatic, a doctrinaire man. He's a compromiser, but not on things which really matter. And these things do matter, and SDI does matter to him.
Okay. Gentleman in the left balcony.
I'd like to move away from the actual content of the summit and turn once more to the preparation for it. Now, Richard Pipes has said that I think you had lunch with the President last week. I gather there was further preparation of the President. I think he's going to see a film. Isn't it Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears? I wonder what significance this might have for the results of the summit, and also could you give us an idea of what kind of preparation Gorbachev is having in the Soviet Union? Which American films, for instance, is he being shown?
He's watching Rambo, yes.
I simply am afraid I cannot answer. I don't know how Gorbachev is being prepared for it. I do know that President Reagan, by virtue of his general background, is a visual man. He likes to see things, and when he sees films, television, he understands it somewhat better than he does in the printed word. That's his background. Now, that isn't what we do at the university, but that's a way of acquiring knowledge. So films have been made for him. I've seen some of those on when there was a succession struggle in the Soviet Union, all the members of the Politburo who had a chance of succeeding and so on and so forth. I have no idea how Gorbachev is being. He has several American experts at his elbow. Just how well prepared they are, I am not sure. All I can say is that when I was in the Soviet Union about 10 years ago in the Institute of USA, and I spent a few days there. This is supposed to be the leading institute, the counterpart of our Russian Research Center. all their opinions on the United States came from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, a U.S. News and World Report. U.S. News and World Report in the first place, perhaps. They didn't have any sophisticated insights. I could trace almost everything they said about the United States to one of these sources. And I presume that they probably boiled down for him what the American media say and presented to him. I understand that while our president likes to have one-page summaries, the Politburo gets 2.5-page summaries. Well, still, it's not going to be very elaborate.
I would venture that an argument that we've had here for many years has finally been solved, and that is that I think Arbatov is playing a very influential role, and many of us thought he was nothing for a long time. But the Time magazine interview showed him sitting next to Gorbachev. Usually there's always the chief assistant who sits next to Gorbachev. Here it was Arbatov, as you know, the head of the Institute of the USA in Canada. And also, if you read the written answers to the written questions that were prepared beforehand, it was very clear in my mind that this was Arbatov speaking. Anyone who's ever heard him speak, this was just, he must have sat down and dictated it in the same way, just as Reagan's parliamentary speech was affected by his advisor, so in this particular case, Arbatov was there. And I think that Arbatov is playing a very critical role. He's already in Geneva, and I think that it looks like Gorbachev is, I think, leaning very heavily on them. Something I would have argued with you about before until the Time magazine.
Yes, but I still don't believe he's the principal American advisor. The principal American advisor is another man who always sits quietly at the table, and whose name is Alexandrov Agentov.
But he wasn't in. I didn't see him in the picture this time.
Not in this particular case, but he's always there.
He's been there for the
last several leaders.
He's been the last several leaders, but I don't know.
Never gives interviews.
But Gorbachev was never in the picture with the last several leaders, and now he's there, and that I think is a remarkable change.
Okay, the gentleman on the left here.
A question to Professor Pipes. If I understood your opening statement and afterwards correctly, the best case scenario for us would have had not to have a summit at all at this point. The next best would have to have a prepared summit. And the third best, if those two couldn't be avoided, not to have a summit in full glare publicity, maybe in some dacha in the Crimea or off Moscow or Camp David. Now, obviously, none of those three cases happen. We have a summit, we have an unprepared, without previous agreement, summit in full glare of publicity. Now, there are three possible conclusions from it. Either the administration was badly advised, which obviously is not the case.
They hadn't been there for a couple of years.
Or they were well advised, which I'm assuming, and they didn't follow the advice, which is stupid. Or they followed the advice and still let themselves be painted into this corner, which is incompetent. Could you comment?
No, you have to appreciate simply the force of public opinion, pressures coming from various sources. People saying, look, you're the first American president in so many years who's never met his Soviet counterpart. You've got a new Soviet counterpart. Feel him out. Maybe he's different. The allies urging, State Department urging, and eventually the president says, all right, let's have a summit. When I was there, we tried to concoct all kinds of variants. One was in '82 that the president would meet Brezhnev sort of accidentally in the United Nations, sort of in the elevator or something like that. And then they'll go and have tea together, but it would not be a summit. It would be just a get acquainted thing. But that fell through. The Russians didn't want it. But we really had this kind of a plan of a very informal, 1-hour session, get acquainted session. Oh, as you call it, photo opportunity. This didn't work out. And I think I left in December '82, and at that time there were still no pressures, but they began to mount about a year later. And for reasons I'm not familiar with, the president decided to yield to them. All along, the White House has been saying, don't expect too much, this is not going to be a big event, nothing is going to happen. But the thing gets out of control. And, pardon? Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have control over the media. The media have their own existence, their own life, and as Dan Burstyn said, they decide what's news. And they have made this a big item of news. These things do happen in government. The democratic administrations are extremely sensitive to the force of public opinion, and they read the press, they look at the TV news in the evening, and they're very, very sensitive to all of this. And if pressures begin to mount, and if every European ally who comes here says, Mr. President, you really ought to see Gorbachev, and so on, it's very difficult to hold out. Then you say, all right, we'll have a meeting, we'll try to keep it down, and then things get out of control.
Well, I don't think it's quite that bad. I don't think things are quite out of that control, and I don't think that Reagan is a victim of the media in this sense. I think Reagan wants to have this meeting. And I think that indeed, if anything, the Soviets find themselves, again, I'm just repeating myself, caught up in this process. I think they're under more pressure because some of my friends have just come back from the Soviet Union, and there were bets about a month ago whether or not the whole summit would take place, because the Russians said, look what's being done. We're being humiliated, and we won't go under those circumstances, but they're going. So I don't think that a thing is kind of running loose quite.
Marshall, but both propositions may be true. They're not contradictory.
Well, no, but I think Reagan really wants it, even though it may not be all the ideal circumstances. I mean, you settled for second best, and I think he wants to do it at this instance.
Okay. Is this a question up on the top floor or not? No. Okay, then we're here.
There's a guy up there.
Professor Goldman, you mentioned half-jokingly that you might be willing to sell the Soviets technology in order to tie them up. Anyone who's used an IBM PC for the first time can appreciate that. But I wonder if you could pursue that a little more seriously and say what kind of trade you would like to pursue with the Soviet Union and how you think that would affect their economy. Professor Pipes, perhaps you could respond particularly on energy technology.
Well, I mean, there hasn't been that much disagreement this evening until now, at least, and I think you'll find a lot. I do believe in trade. I don't believe in selling them the most sophisticated thing, and the problem is to find, Bernard Baruch said the only thing that was not militarily strategic or military useful in some way was bubble gum. I mean, even buttons would qualify. But I do believe in it. I don't think they use it all that effectively. If you really want to worry about what our trade will do, you look at East Asia. You send something to East Asia, you know it's going to be enhanced and come back and it's going to be more competitive. That's not the case in dealing with the Soviet Union, although I will acknowledge that they use their trade to improve their military technology in particular. But I'm not suggesting we sell them these very sophisticated things. I think, what happened when we sell them components, they find that they break down and they have to come back to us. I don't mind selling them grain. I think it's important that we do that. It's interesting to see what's happening to their agriculture. Their agriculture is becoming more and more dependent on imported grain rather than less. And that's what world trade is all about. I think that in the long run, to the extent that if you're going to break down the society, you really have to involve them more in the world economy. I don't, again, mean to say that will happen overnight. I also do believe we should sell them energy technology because in my mind, we're the beneficiaries of that. The more energy there is in the world, the better off we are since we are an energy importing nation. So I would want to get them involved. I would want to get them intertwined, and I don't think they can use it well enough to solve their problems and become a very significant threat.
Well, I am very much against trade with the Soviet Union, particularly industrial goods, particularly energy. And the reason for that is that energy constitutes the major item of Soviet export. And the more oil they have, the more gas they have, the more hard currency they get, and the more they can engage in the kind of adventures which they're engaging in. Much of that money goes to subsidize Eastern Europe, Cuba, Vietnam, and what have you. Therefore, I am against it, except with one exception, and that's fusion energy. I understand, I should have said it before, that there's a possibility of an agreement on exchanges of information on fusion energy, which is the energy of the 21st century. And it happens to be the one field where the Soviet Union is probably ahead of us, where we can learn something from them. So there's a possibility of an agreement on that. So I'm all for agreements on fusion energy. I'm against selling them pumps, drilling equipment, and everything else that they need to increase, with our help, their oil resources, which they then sell and buy high technology and turn them into weapons.
Okay. Up here in the right-hand corner.
I'd like to ask another question about personalities. This is for those of us who watch the morning news shows. And I would like to ask each of you what you think is going to take place with the clash of the first ladies. I've read that Nancy Reagan turned Reagan onto conservatism, and Mrs. Gorbachev teaches Marxist ideology, I believe, at a university in Moscow. I wonder, what are these women going to have to talk to each other about, and what are they going to come away thinking of each other?
Well, there are those who say that Marxism is a conservative ideology, and so the two of them, in some sense, can find a lot in common. I think the main thing they have in common is both of them want to make want their husbands to do well. That's a chauvinistic thing to say, but I think both of them indeed are very much interested in seeing that that this thing comes off, and that their husbands come out looking like world statesmen and diplomats. And I'm serious when I said earlier, keep your eye on what the two of them do, because I think they may come up with more between them than their husbands in some cases, and I think that they're really going to be backstopping and pushing their husbands in a way that we're not accustomed to seeing. There was one of my, one of my friends was looking at the summit meeting, the mini summit meeting that took place in, I guess it was Bulgaria, where the Warsaw Pact nations got together, kind of a pep talk before Gorbachev went to Geneva. There were all the party officials and Mrs. Gorbachev. The first time a woman has ever shown up, much less been photographed at any one of those events. I think that she plays a very important role.
Well, I think it's simply because of her appearance. I mean, she's the first Soviet First Lady whom you can present. We didn't even know there was a Mrs. Andropov. The CIA didn't know there was a Mrs. Andropov until she appeared at the funeral. And then you understood why. Now, here you've got a good-looking, well-dressed woman, and they're very proud of it. So they parade her. I very much doubt if she will have any influence whatever on policy. I don't know about Mrs. Reagan. I don't know about that. But I doubt if Mr. Gorbachev will have any influence on the course of events.
Okay, question here.
Yeah, I have a very short question. You said at the end of your pessimistic prospect on the summit, it will be a battle of charms, and you're very sure the president will make it by knockout victory. Do you think that applies also to the populations of Western Europe and Eastern Europe countries?
That is, whether his charm will appeal to the people of Western Europe and Eastern Europe?
Reagan's charm.
Look in these terms to the summit.
Well, I don't know what terms we look in. I mean, undoubtedly they would like to have results, but it takes two to tango, as you know. And if the Soviet Union does not get off dead center where they have been, if they come up with ludicrous arms control proposals, which even the Europeans recognize to be ludicrous. I mean, they have rejected one of 4 proposals that Gorbachev made within 24 hours, the one to negotiate separately with the British and the French. When the Dutch have turned him down and decided to install cruise missiles and so on, when all this happens, then I'm afraid they have no choice but to watch a battle of charms, because there's nothing else left.
I'm a little more pessimistic. I think the public relations field is more delicate, because I think the Europeans, finding themselves caught in the middle, are prepared to sacrifice principle in some cases for expediency, or what they view, they want principle, and the principle is that they don't want to have Europe armed and they don't want to be caught in the middle. And I think given the demonstrations that took place earlier, there is a very strong sentiment in Western Europe that there should be some accommodation. And if the Soviets can convince them that it's the Americans that are holding back, I think that would be unfortunate. And I don't know, given Reagan's reputation outside the United States, he generates a lot of hostility in Western Europe, and I think this is a problem. This is not to say that Gorbachev is regarded as a charmer, but I think there it's more of an issue and more of an uncertain resolution. How the thing will be resolved is uncertain.
Unfortunately, for those of you who are still wanting to ask questions, we've come to the end of the work rules. Whether the summit succeeds in doing any more than bringing out this large a crowd on a rainy night for an education about the subject, I'm not sure. But for that, and especially for Marshall Goldman and Dick Pipes, we're very grateful. So thank you. Thank you.